It is a beautiful day, so you could be doing all kinds of other fun things. So hopefully I can keep your attention. So as Arpi was mentioning, I work at the Rocky Mountain Immigrant Advocacy Network in Denver. And my career has kind of gone all over the place. I have worked in private practice. I've clerked at the border. I lived in El Paso for a couple of years. I have been at Remain now for almost 7 years, focusing mostly on adult detention. Before Remain, I was doing family detention work in Texas. So I've kind of bopped around a little bit, but through that I've been able to gain a much greater understanding of the U.S. immigration system and how our laws and policies impact people on an individual basis as well as on a systemic level. So I'm hoping to just kind of walk through some of the things that I work on and that I've learned over the years, and then I would love to open it up to each one of you to ask me any questions that you might have. I'm hoping to be a resource. And I might not know everything, because the thing is, immigration is a really complicated issue in this country. And so if for some reason I don't know an answer, then I will get back to you and do my best to try and educate everyone here to the degree that you all want. I don't know where do I have to point this, Claire, for it to click through? Oh, there we go. Okay, so first we're just going to kind of talk more broadly about what it is that we're talking about with immigration law, how immigration policies are implemented and shaped here in the United States, just like how does the system function? Like how do the different branches of government interact? How do federal law and policy interact with state and local policies and laws? And then we're going to talk some more about shifts over time. Arby mentioned the family separation policy, which was, something that got a lot of media attention during the Trump administration. And so that's just one example of ways in which the executive branch can really shape how cases are running and how people are accessing or not the legal system that we have in place. And then we're going to talk more about the Biden administration, what's happening right now on a federal level, and how that impacts us here in Colorado. Okay, so who is it that we're talking about? We're talking about people who are long-term residents of Colorado. So a lot of times I'll have clients who have lived in Colorado since well before I was ever born, and that they have a U.S. citizen spouse, many U.S. citizen kiddos, and they might somehow have to interact with the immigration system and be detained, and the government tries to deport them. And so those are long-term members of our community who've been here for decades, and they might be impacted by the immigration system. We're also talking about people moving from other states, because Colorado is a wonderful place to live, as we all know. I was just talking to Claire over there about how I grew up in Michigan, but I went to greener pastures here in Colorado. I love the sunshine, I love hiking. So, the same is true for a lot of other folks who have resettled here from elsewhere in the country, but who, again, might be long-term residents of the United States. We're talking about people who recently arrived in Colorado. I'm sure a lot of you heard in about December-ish, we started seeing large busloads of people coming up from the southern border. The majority of them were Venezuelan with some Nicaraguans mixed in, and they were very, very recently arriving here in Colorado, and so we'll talk a little bit about them. And then where else are people coming from who are resettling here in Colorado? Well, we have a long history of people coming to Colorado from Mexico, and as I'm sure all of you know, Colorado used to be part of Mexico. So in fact, a lot of people here, our Hispanic population here in Colorado, especially in like the Trinidad area, they have actually lived here longer than Colorado's been a state. And so, that's like one aspect of what we're talking about. But we're seeing a huge uptick of people coming from places that are less common. So we've seen people coming from Guatemala, El Salvador, Honduras for probably the past 15 or 20 years has been like a larger flow of people coming from that region. But what we're seeing, as I was just mentioning, is a lot of people coming from Venezuela, Nicaragua, Cuba, Colombia, because of shifts in the political climate in those countries, and that has resulted in a larger flow of migrants. The same is true for Haiti. I'm sure everybody here is very well aware of the instability in Haiti after the assassination of the president, and so we have also seen an uptick in people coming from Haiti. And then very timely, we've seen a large uptick of people coming from Afghanistan, Ukraine, and Russia. And all of those folks are coming to Colorado just like they are other locations in the United States. So we'll talk some more about that. So how is immigration policy shaped in the United States? And what is the interaction between the different branches of government? I think it's really easy to think about immigration as just being a federal issue, and there's not a lot we can do about it locally because that's up to the president and potentially up to Congress, and we all complain about how Congress doesn't take any action and haven't since the last time there was comprehensive immigration reform in 1996 under President Clinton. So that is all true, very frankly, that is very true, but there is a huge interplay, right, between the executive branch who puts together executive orders and policies and things like that, and the judiciary, and we see that play out all the time when cases head to the Supreme Court. We'll talk about DACA a little bit, and that's deferred action for childhood arrivals. And that's a case that recently was up at the Supreme Court and has gone back down through the judicial branch. So there's an interplay at the federal level, and Congress, while they're a sleeping giant, it would appear, they do have some power too, right? Because they talk to the president all the time. They talk to the vice president. And so even if they can't get huge laws passed, they definitely put pressure on the executive branch to try and sway them in different directions. When they say they're gonna maybe put together a policy, then we see members of Congress going and putting pressure on the executive if they don't like the policy that's being talked about, and we'll discuss that a little bit more. And then what is the interplay between federal and state government? So, even though immigration is a federal issue in terms of how it's legislated, we have a lot of power on a local level. I'm sure all of you are aware that Fort Collins is one of 2 municipalities in the state of Colorado that has a legal defense fund for non-citizens. So the city of Fort Collins has made this a priority and said we want to pay to make sure that people have access to legal counsel when they're in immigration removal proceedings, and they have to fight their immigration cases. This is a priority of ours, and it's akin to a public defender system. So say somebody has a criminal charge against them, they have a right under Supreme Court case law that they can have access to counsel for most types of criminal proceedings. The same is the push for universal representation in the immigration context to make sure that people have access to free legal counsel should they be placed in immigration proceedings. So that is something that exists here in Fort Collins and in Denver, and we're the only 2 municipalities in the state of Colorado to have these types of legal defense funds. And then the state of Colorado has a legal defense fund as well. While this is terribly exciting, and I am thrilled to be able to say that because not a lot of places in the country have these types of systems. It's truly along the coast. It's like New York and California. There's like a blip of activity in Chicago, but Colorado was one of the first states in the whole country to put together a legal defense fund like this to make sure that people have access to counsel. While that's wonderful, it's not funded to the degree that like a public defender system would be, and so only a minority of people who have a need for legal counsel can actually qualify under this fund because there's not enough money to pay for an attorney for each and every person. But that's part of what Remain, Rocky Mountain Immigrant Advocacy Network, the organization where I work, we've dedicated our resources toward trying to expand that, because we believe so strongly in the power of access to counsel. And just to kind of quantify that for you, people are 10.5 times more likely to win their immigration case if they have an attorney by their side working with them on their case, helping them gather evidence in support of their legal claims, helping them understand the legal system because it's very complicated. It's like a patchwork quilt of different laws that were passed at different times. And so that's really a huge place where locally we can make an impact on how this system functions. And then there's a law that is very close to being signed, a bill, I should say, that's very close to being signed by the governor that is trying to end the practice of ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, working with local law enforcement to jail people in ICE custody. And so what that bill would do is end any new contracts either between government officials and ICE, like local government officials, I should say, and ICE, as well as preventing any new private detention facilities from sprouting up here in Colorado. I'm sure you're all well aware that there is one very large ICE detention facility in Aurora, and that's where most of the community members who are detained in the state of Colorado end up going. Unfortunately, this would not end the practice of detaining people there, but it is a building block for us to try and push the needle and get policy changes and laws in place to prevent private detention here in this state. So that's kind of the ways in which these different facets interact. But let's talk some more about policies. So I mentioned family detention. Are you all aware that under the Bush administration, that was the first iteration of family detention? And George W. Bush. And that's when families were detained in Texas. And he got a lot of really bad press because there were tiny children wearing like prison jumpsuits. And that was released in the media, and he was really condemned for that. And so they ended the practice shortly thereafter. It was President Obama who actually reinstated family detention in 2014 at a makeshift facility in Artesia, New Mexico. I actually went down there that summer that policy started. Or restarted, I should say. And then they created 2 pretty large detention facilities in Texas, and those were operating up and through the Biden administration, so through Obama, Trump, and Biden. And when Biden got to office, he said, I'm shutting that down. This is immoral. We should not hold families in a prison, because let's be very clear, this is a prison that people are held in. And he shut it down. But what we've heard, there's been some leaks from the White House that he's contemplating bringing it back because of political pressure from particularly the Republicans, of course, that our southern border, we're having so many people coming trying to seek asylum here. And so he wants to try and prevent people from accessing our system in a willy-nilly kind of way, and so he wants to detain folks. We'll talk more about why detention isn't actually necessary, and it's in effect very, very costly. But that's one policy that I think has gotten some attention in the past, and I want to make sure that it's on your radars because it's something that is very likely going to happen again in the near future, unfortunately. Family separation. So when we talk about family separation, that was a policy where, a parent would come with kiddos, like one child or more, and they were separated as soon as they crossed the border. They were housed together initially, and it was pretty wild because we were working with about 20 people who had been separated from their kiddos who were detained here in Colorado and Aurora, and they would tell us almost identical stories about how their kids were taken away from them. It was either because they were being prosecuted for unlawfully entering the United States, or it was because they were having their kiddo taken away to have a bath. And the people who were taking the kids would say, oh, don't worry, we're just going to give your kid a bath and they'll be back shortly. And they didn't come back. They were put into either private foster facilities or foster care homes. And it was extraordinarily traumatizing for them. But this was a policy that came down during the Trump administration that Trump enacted, even though it had actually been talked about in the White House before Trump took office. George W. Bush, in fact, had talked about it and said, no, that's too cruel, I won't do that. That's not the best policy for us. And because it had kind of been broached and thought about before, it was actually pretty easy for the Trump administration to adopt that policy. And there are still families who are separated due to that policy. You know, I don't actually work on this type of litigation, but folks are filing Federal Tort Claims Act claims. So they're saying that the government committed a tort against folks whose families were separated because of the immense stress and trauma that people endured from that policy. And so the government is actually now having to pay money out to these families who were tormented by this policy. We're seeing huge restrictions on who can qualify for asylum. I'll talk more about Title 42, which is something that's still in effect. I'll talk more about President Biden's proposed asylum ban, and then processing of cases. So making more hurdles that people have to jump over in order to be able to qualify for asylum is really the main thing that we're seeing, because so many people are coming to the United States to flee repressive regimes. And so as a result of that, we're seeing an uptick of cases, but I'll talk more about other factors that are contributing to that. And then implications of viability for immigration relief based on where people are coming from. So the US government does not view everybody as being equal when it comes to our immigration laws. This has been a long acting policy that's embedded in our laws, in fact. You can see, for example, asylum claims from China. There are special elements of asylum claims from China with the one-child policy, where it made it much, much more easy for people from China to be able to access asylum in the United States. Because they were coming from a communist country. So it's the same was true for Cubans. There was the Cuban Adjustment Act. So these facets of our law that kind of overlap with foreign policy also show up in how our immigration law is written and how it's implemented. And then we're also going to talk about deferred action for childhood arrivals, which I was just mentioning is something that creates protections for people who were born here, or excuse me, not born here, who were here at a certain period of time, and I'll go through the qualifications. And so right now they're able to qualify for work access and things like that, social security numbers, they can qualify for all kinds of things, but it's very unclear how that's going to move forward and how that will continue to shape our communities. So to be eligible for DACA, people have to have arrived in the United States prior to turning age 16, and then before June 15th, 2007. That you can read through the other qualifications, but I think the main takeaway is that over 900,000 people have been able to stay and work in the United States as a result of this executive order that came down under the Obama administration. And we call folks who qualify for DACA commonly dreamers, right? And so we keep talking about the DREAM Act. Congress has not passed the DREAM Act, and it still doesn't look like it's going to pass anytime soon because Congress can't seem to agree on what is best for this country. But I will tell you that having about over 900,000 people losing access to being able to work lawfully in the United States is going to have a huge economic impact on the country should that come to fruition. So I'm not totally sure how it's going to play out, but it's something that we're all watching very closely. So right now, DACA does not provide a pathway to citizenship. It does not provide anybody with a green card. It only is like a handshake agreement saying, we won't deport you. We're going to take deferred action on your case. Nothing's going to happen to you as long as you qualify for this benefit. And you can stay and kind of coexist with people who do have permanent status, who might be lawful permanent residents, who might be US citizens, but it doesn't offer anything more than that. So as an immigration attorney, I'm thrilled to say that I have actually helped tons of clients who had DACA originally, who was struck by Cupid's arrow and were able to marry a US citizen, but even to be able to qualify to adjust your status to get a green card through marriage, DACA recipients have had to travel outside of the country and be paroled back in. And so that's like a whole nother step in a legal process for people to have the resources to get an attorney to represent them in these types of cases, to travel outside of the country and come back in. All of these steps just so that they can hopefully find another pathway forward to get lawful immigration status. I personally think that there should be a pathway forward where you don't have to jump through all of these hoops to be able to, live a life that, in many instances, especially with DACA recipients, they didn't even know that they weren't US citizens until they turned a certain age. And I can relate to that. I lived in another country until I was age 8. And it's something that really impacts me to think through, like, I was taken there by my parents. I am a US citizen and was brought back to the States, but that is such a huge privilege in terms of having this citizenship, because I can travel a lot more freely in the world than people who are citizens of other countries, right? And so not everybody really has a keen understanding of all of these elements of their life until it is that they want to try and get a driver's license, or they're applying for student loans when they're going to college and having to have these really hard conversations with their parents and immigration attorneys who are then having to weigh in on what their best paths forward are. So right now, DACA is on hold in terms of anybody new being able to get a benefit from DACA, but we are seeing them renew applications for people who've already had it. The other piece there is that not a lot of new people qualify for DACA because on the last slide, I'm sure you all saw, there's like very specific dates of time, and a lot of people were too little to be able to qualify, who now would otherwise be able to qualify, right? And so it's kind of a remnant of this like frozen moment in time that isn't adjusting to where we are today. So, as a lawyer, you go to law school and you think through, what is the legal system anyway? Like, we're just like living in a big society, and the law is supposed to adjust and change to reflect how it is that we want to coexist and the rules that we have for ourselves. And so I think that this is a really good example of how the law has not adjusted in real time to the needs of the United States and the people who are living here now. So right now, DACA is stuck in litigation. We were thrilled as legal advocates when the Supreme Court did not strike down DACA, and was, pretty shocking, honestly, coming from such a conservative Supreme Court. But I think that they recognized the huge ramifications that would happen if it was struck down. But then it was remanded back down. So now it's in front of a judge in Texas. And I'll tell you that judges in Texas typically are very conservative. So it's not a good place for a policy like this that has such sweeping implications for everybody in the whole country to be sitting on the desk of a very, very conservative judge who wrote such a poor decision in his initial decision that meant that it got remanded back down to him. So we're just kind of waiting to see. And I'm very curious to see if this might be the moment where Congress decides that it actually does have to act because of what I was saying, right? What a huge impact this would have on our economy. And while you can't always depend on people's hearts and minds on this issue of immigration, right? Because it's very stratified in terms of like our moral compass when it comes to this issue. But, Republicans are definitely fiscally conservative, and they recognize that the impact on our economy might be grave. And so, I'm curious to see how that all plays out. So under the Biden administration, there have been a number of new policies that have been implemented, but there's also a lot of holdovers from the Trump administration. And I don't know, the media doesn't really cover that super well, in my opinion. So I want to walk through some policies that Trump put into place that have not been lifted under the Biden administration, even though when he ran for office, he ran on a platform of change and saying that he would shift these things, and it hasn't happened. So Title 42 is something that came into effect during the pandemic. It comes from an old law from 1944 that's a public health law that says we can't let people in times of emergency into the country because we're afraid that they might spread some type of disease. So I would just say the basic underpinnings of the law are racist, because the whole idea that somebody migrating to a different country is going to spread disease is like systemically racist. But it was implemented by the Trump administration under the context of the COVID pandemic. And it has allowed the United States to expel about 2.5 million migrants. I should say that number is a bit skewed because they're counting each and every contact with Customs and Border Patrol as a new contact. What immigration advocates have learned is that, people usually try about 8 times to access the border before they're let in or they're able to go to a location that's not a port of entry and sneak across the border, essentially. And oftentimes when they do that, they're still apprehended by Customs and Border Protection. And in many instances, our clients say that they wave down Customs and Border Protection, asking them to take them into custody because they're trying to seek asylum, but that they were turned away so many times when they were at the port of entry that they couldn't actually access the judicial system here in the United States. One of the tricky things is that Mexico has actually agreed to take a bunch of people back into their country. So the US government is able just to turn people away and say, sorry, you're not able to come into the United States because of this health emergency, which is in place right now, even though we're all in this room, we're not, for the most part, most of us are not wearing masks. I think, we have kind of returned to, some normalcy. I don't think we'll ever be back to a place before the pandemic, of course, but we're still using this as a mechanism to make sure that people can't access asylum in the United States. It is a policy that's still in effect, but it is scheduled to end very soon on May 11th. So we will see how that goes. It's been scheduled to end a number of times and has been halted through litigation. But that's the current plan. There are pushes in Congress to create legislation that would actually formalize this policy forevermore. And it's been really a struggle talking to some of our senators, quite frankly. Well, we only have 2, so both of them, about this issue, as well as our representatives. So this is where I would love to make a plug to this community, because, Congress has a lot of power when it comes to these issues, and it's critical that they hear from their constituents to know what it is that we want when it comes to these types of policies, particularly when it comes to asylum, right? Because so many people who are directly impacted by their decisions aren't able to vote. And so it really matters for the rest of us in the community who are able to vote that we stand up for the people that we care about and the ideals that we care about. So the Biden administration does not fully intend to re-implement asylum as it was before the pandemic when it comes back, theoretically, on May 11th. So we'll talk about Biden's proposed asylum ban or transit ban. This is mirrored off of a policy. It's almost identical, in fact, to a policy that the Trump administration put into effect. And so Biden's plan would allow border authorities to deny asylum to most migrants coming to the United States who have passed through another country. Doing this work, I'll just tell you, almost everybody has passed through another country unless they're coming from Mexico directly. And so, migrants will have to have applied for asylum in a third country, traversed along the way. A lot of migrants are being targeted for violence in the countries that they pass through. So the fact that the Biden administration is trying to make them stay in countries that are unsafe for them is pretty disheartening. And then even if folks do make it to the border, they have to now seek, they use an app on their phones to schedule appointments to be able to seek asylum at the border. I will just tell you, I work with a lot of folks who are indigenous, who have never used a cell phone. The apps don't represent all languages. So it's really a hierarchical structure of like, who is it that can navigate this type of technology? Who is it that has this technology in their language for them to be able to access our systems? And if you don't schedule an appointment that way, they can turn you away and potentially even deport you. So the policy would have some exemptions, but it's yet another hurdle that many hurdles in fact, that people would have to jump over to be able to even just knock on our door and say, hi, I'm here, I want to apply for asylum. I'll tell you, I just finished teaching, I teach a law school class at the University of Denver. I just spent 14 weeks with my students trying to teach them how the asylum system works, and on Friday we had our review day, and they were still confused. These are law students who are very well educated, who speak English and are listening to me speak English to them and explaining how our asylum system works. And it is wildly complicated. So I just want to highlight the fact that it takes this much energy and effort to even be able to knock on the door because of these policies, it just is making it almost impossible for people to access this system that has been in place that recognizes the needs of people fleeing for their lives. But we are essentially turning our backs on folks and saying, if you can't do these very, very specific things, then you don't get to come here. So Biden also has an asylum processing rule, which is a whole new way to process asylum cases that's different than one of the other different iterations of how to process asylum cases that have come down from various administrations. I won't go into all of the details of how to apply for asylum. At this point, there are about 4 different mechanisms through which somebody could apply for asylum. It is very complicated to know which pathway a person can go down. You need to know a lot of back facts about them. And it makes it really hard to explain to people from the very same community, you can qualify to apply for asylum this way, down this path, but looking at your paperwork, you have to go down that pathway. And quite frankly, it's sown a lot of distrust of immigration attorneys because people are like, no, that's not how my cousin did it. I think you're wrong. And I'm like, yes, I promise you, I agree that it's very confusing and it doesn't make sense and it does seem like I'm wrong. But because there's so many different iterations of how this can function, it's completely unfair, but your cousin can qualify in a totally different way than you can. And so that's been really hard to explain. This is just another pathway that people can go down in order to be able to apply for asylum. And they're fast-tracking the cases with the asylum office, where people will usually have an adjudication within 21 to 45 days. after their initial screening interview, after they first came into the country. So that's a lot. I'm not sure how many of you know how asylum cases are processed. That is much, much faster than any other mechanism. Which can be great, right? If you have a really strong case and it's very clear to the asylum officer you qualify, I will tell you, political opinion claims from certain countries are really easy to win because it's so clear in the law when people have been coming from that country for years and years. Cuba is a great example because we have so much literature around the oppressive government in Cuba. That is a pathway that has commonly been relatively easy for people. I won't say it's easy by any stretch of the imagination, but in comparison to other asylum seekers, for example. So it's great for people with strong claims. But for people who might need to gather evidence, who don't understand the immigration laws, because that's the other thing, you'll talk to Cuban asylum seekers, and there's a lot of word of mouth because so many Cubans have fled from Cuba to the United States over decades, right? They have passed a lot of information about how the law works, what kind of evidence you might need, things like that people don't know when they're coming from a place like Nicaragua, that has like a more recent transition in its government that has become wildly abusive and oppressive, but maybe they don't have the same type of structure or infrastructure, I should say, within their communities to understand how things function. It minimizes people's access to counsel, the time spent to gather all of the resources that they need. And so the denial rates are much, much higher in these types of cases than ones where people do have higher rates of access to counsel. Biden has also created some parole programs, which nothing is black or white when it comes to these types of policies. So they can lend themselves to people in a really positive way. So we're seeing Cubans, Nicaraguans, Venezuelans, and Haitians who are able to be paroled into the United States. Parole is a very strange term of art. It's basically just signaling that it's temporary. It's a short period, typically 2 years, somebody could stay in the United States. And maybe they're just waiting and hoping things get better in their country. Though, if you look at this list of countries, the likelihood of things shifting dramatically in 2 years is pretty slim, knowing what's happening on the ground there. You also have to have a sponsor in the United States to be able to apply for these types of parole programs. So you have to be well connected, right? You also have to be able to travel to the United States on a plane. I don't know if you all have looked at flights. I was just looking this up recently. I think it was $1,200 to buy a ticket from Port-au-Prince to, I think, New York. I was looking at this like a couple weeks ago. And so thinking about knowing what's going on in Haiti, thinking about who is it from that country who would be able to afford that cost, it's only people at like the highest levels of the societal structure who could afford that, right? So we're really talking about allowing people from these countries to come to the United States if they're already very well connected and wealthy, right? And it doesn't afford them any lasting status, but it at least gets their foot in the door so they could potentially apply for asylum once they get here. But it's a mechanism for people to be able to come. So that's great, but it's very limited in scope in terms of who can qualify. The same, we have parole for people coming from Afghanistan. About 77,000 people were initially processed after the US withdrew from Afghanistan, and they have been able to be paroled into the country. There are huge backlogs with Afghan asylum cases. But what we've seen is that after that initial rush of people, there has been a horrific slowdown in terms of processing these cases for anybody outside of the United States. So less than 0.3% have actually been approved for parole after that initial wave of folks. So everybody else is just stuck in limbo, either in Afghanistan itself or in any other country where the diaspora is spread. Ukraine is the most successful of the parole programs. So we saw people being let in from Ukraine immediately in that initial wave, right after the war broke out there, but they have been processed for parole at much, much higher rates than anybody else. And so a lot of immigration advocates have said there are some racial undertones here that are wildly problematic. If you can offer that to Ukrainians, you should be able to offer that same type of rigorous processing to anybody in the world. Everybody should be treated equally when it comes to being able to access our asylum system or our parole system, right? When their lives are in danger and they're fleeing. That is our obligation under US law and international law. But that's just, quite frankly, not the way that the policies are playing out. So let's talk a bit more about case processing in Colorado. Again, this is a very complicated issue, but I know RP mentioned that people have questions around it. I'll do my best to answer them in the Q&A, but I did want to just kind of walk through the differences between affirmative asylum and defensive asylum. So affirmative asylum is where somebody entered the United States lawfully, so maybe they came on parole. Maybe they were paroled in from Afghanistan, for example, right? And then they can go to the asylum office, which is part of US Citizenship and Immigration Services. It's a sub-agency within the Department of Homeland Security, where you can say, hey, I'm here, you know I'm here, but I'm afraid to go back to my home country and I want to seek asylum. So you just have an interview with an asylum officer and you don't have a prosecutor from the government arguing as to why you should be deported. You just sit in a little government office and tell the officer your story. And then they can either grant your case right there and then, they can give you a decision, a couple weeks later, granting your case, or if they deny your case, they can refer your case to the immigration court, where an immigration judge will then look at it and review whether or not you can qualify for asylum there. Now, with a defensive asylum case, you don't have access to the asylum office at the outset. You never have that interview with just the asylum officer talking about your story. The only context in which you get to apply for asylum is in front of an immigration judge and a prosecutor from Immigration and Customs Enforcement next to you arguing why you should be deported, why you should not win your asylum case. So it's a lot more antagonistic. The stakes are much higher. You're submitting evidence very formally. There's witnesses who are presented. You might pull in experts to come testify on your behalf. It's a full case, very similar to our criminal legal process, right? And that's the way that we process these cases. It's modeled off of whether or not somebody committed a crime. But that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about a factually driven inquiry as to whether or not you suffered past persecution or are likely to suffer future persecution if you're deported. So, fundamentally, I think that there could be some shifts to the way that we're processing these cases that are fairer, that infuse fairness into the system. And if we are going to have an antagonistic system the way that we do, we're paying government attorneys to represent ICE. We should certainly have attorneys representing the non-citizens in the same types of proceedings. So another distinction, as I was just talking about, is country of origin. So like I mentioned, we're seeing distinctions between the different kinds of parole proceedings that people can access. And then we have what's called temporary protected status. That's for folks who have fled their home country. There's 28 countries on that list, and they might be able to qualify for a very temporary form of protection here in the United States. But again, that depends on which country you're coming from. What we're seeing with the asylum office, I was just talking about those interviews with an asylum officer in one room. Almost all of those interviews right now are just for people coming from Afghanistan because they're trying to process those cases given how many people came. And I think what the administration initially thought is that the Afghan Adjustment Act would pass, such that anybody who had come in that initial wave, those 77,000 people, would be able to automatically adjust their status and get on a pathway to get their green card, to become US citizens. That did not pass. And so now the asylum offices are having to adjudicate each and every one of those 77,000 claims in order for them to be able to gain access to asylum. Their parole status is actually going to run out very soon, so we're still waiting to see how the US government handles that, because when their parole status runs out, they won't be eligible to qualify for work permit any longer. It will also strip them of other types of benefits and leave them in legal limbo. So again, that's an area to plug. If you want to talk to our elected officials who are in Congress, that's something that's certainly very, very important in terms of stabilizing people's lives here. Family units are targeted. So you know how I was talking about Biden's asylum processing rule, how they're fast-tracking those cases? This is another way to fast-track cases, but it's specific to families. So they're trying to move those through the system as quickly as they can. Again, it's kind of a double-edged sword, right? In some instances, it's great because people can access the judicial system. If they have a very strong case and they have an attorney, then it's likely that they would be able to win their case pretty quickly. But as we just discussed, you're over 10 times more likely to win your case if you have an attorney. If your case is processing that quickly, it's really hard to find an attorney to take it, unfortunately. And so what we're seeing is that 15.5% of people in this type of processing have counsel because they're having to have their cases heard within 300 days of their initial hearing, versus most people who are before the Denver Immigration Court, for example, have over 90% of them have an attorney to help them with their cases. So the fact that these families are going through so quickly means that their likelihood of success is much, much lower because they don't have access to counsel and they don't have access to all the things we were just talking about in terms of evidence and advice. So processing times are different depending on all kinds of different factors. Affirmative asylum, as I mentioned, Afghan cases are going very quickly. For some people, they've been waiting well over a decade to even have their asylum interview with the asylum office. Defensive asylum, so if you have expedited proceedings like I was just talking about, your case might be heard in less than a year. I have a client whose case has been pending in front of the Denver Immigration Court for 12 years and has still not been heard, right? So it's not like the first person to apply is the first person to be heard. No, that just depends on whatever policy is being exercised at any given time. So that's kind of the overview that I wanted to provide you all based on some questions that Arpi had prompted me with. But I'm sure there's things that raised questions for you that I said, or some areas of immigration law that I didn't cover. So I want to make sure you all have the opportunity to ask questions and let me know if there's anything more I can offer since we're all here together.
Is this working? There we go. Thank you so much. Let's give a round of applause to Laura before we go to questions. I know that's a lot of information, and it might feel overwhelming. We are recording today. We just didn't tell you that in advance because we wanted you to actually come today. But what I recommend is when that recording posts, probably to Trinity's website, listen to it a couple times while you're going for a walk, because it's so dense and it takes a little time. Even those of us that are trying to keep up, even though we're not lawyers and study it, it takes a little time for it to kind of soak in, and then it will probably change. But we'll make that available to everybody. I'll have a few announcements about how you can sign up to make sure you're getting these kinds of announcements. So if you're not sure you're going to get that link, the only way we can get it to you is if we make sure you're on our mailing list and stuff. So now I'd love to open up to questions. Hay preguntas, are there questions? And we're going to use this, and if someone is asking a question in Spanish, before Laura answers it, even though she's bilingual, we're going to have it repeated in English by our interpreters. Carolina?
Thank you. I have a question.
Sure.
It's not specific to asylum, but for you as a lawyer, I work with a lot of undocumented people, older adults specific to that. There's a new benefit that got approved, which is the old age pension, right? And I just want to make sure that I'm doing things right and not get them in trouble if they don't have, so my question is, when I'm helping them apply to that benefit, would that affect them when if they decide then to become residents of the USA, and or if they are in the process of that? Because I just helped someone like that.
So I'll just, as a first point, I'm not an expert in public benefits, and in fact, we actually have a social work team that helps people when they're applying for public benefits. We have one attorney who is an expert in that area. So if you do have like specific instances of this arising and you want to double check, then I could refer you to them to help. But I would say the one issue that attorneys flag when it comes to applying for benefits is that when you apply for your green card, you can be dinged, essentially, if you are viewed to be a public charge. So that's the only thing. There would need to be an analysis as to whether or not them applying for the benefits would lead to a finding from a government official that there's likely to pull on government resources if they become a green card holder. And so I can't say like categorically how that plays out, but it's just something where you would want to do an individualized analysis to make sure that they're good to go and they wouldn't have an issue with that. Does that answer your question?
Yes, that's fine. That's
Okay.
what I've been just saying. Talk to your lawyer if they are already in a case, just to make
Yeah,
sure.
but if you have like blanket questions like that, let me know, because I can ask people in our office who work on those types of cases much more than I do.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Here.
Thank you so much. I found quite a bit of clarity there.
Oh, good. I hope
Though
so.
Arpi says by the time we understand it, it probably will have changed.
That's how I feel all the time, just to be clear.
You mentioned twice areas that we could influence our legislators. I think that most of us will be more likely to contact our legislators if you were able to give to ARPI to put on the website exactly what you were recommending, because I couldn't quite track. I know one had to do with what didn't pass for the 77,000 Afghans,
Yeah.
and something had to do with the family detention.
Wow, I'm impressed you were taking notes.
But I
I
didn't,
promise I won't test you later.
but I didn't get it well enough that I can reach out to my legislators. But I
so-
bet you anything, at least 10 to 20% of the people here would do that if you can help us understand what it is we need to say.
I will work with ARPI on that, because, in fact, ARPI and I have talked about how the nonprofits in Colorado need to be better unified when it comes to some of this messaging, because we usually send out like action alerts or things like that on our social media, but I think it would be great if across the state we're working together with ISAC, with other partners like the American Friends Service Committee, with the Colorado Immigrant Rights Coalition. There are a bunch of groups working on this, and so I think that we can be in touch about how to better coordinate so that RP can make sure that you all have access to that information when it's timely. Because the thing is, you could talk to your legislators right now about the Afghan Adjustment Act, for example, but it's not on the table right now, so it's not top of mind to them. And so really the best time to talk to like reach out and make phone calls or emails or, you know, any other type of organizing is when it's actually going up for a vote. And so that's something that I think we could, as a coalition, be a lot better about. And so we'll definitely be in touch more readily, I think, about that.
And wasn't the other point the
Yes, exactly.
So any time would be a good time to talk about.
I think you can talk about DACA at any point, but again, it's in my experience working with our senators and our representatives, they are most responsive when it's something that's happening in that moment because they have so much going on at all times. So anytime, if you have a conversation with them, you can raise these issues at any time, or even just say, like, as a blanket issue, immigration is really important to me. Like, that's necessary for them to hear. But when it comes to like action, to call and email and things like that, it's has the greatest impact when they are like preparing to sign a letter or to vote on an amendment or an act or whatever. So I think that that's something that we can certainly work toward.
Yeah, we can definitely, we've been talking about this a bit, and some of you are on Isaac's advocacy task force mailing list, where you're getting kind of these action alerts. Some of them are local, Fort Collins, city council, some are state level, and some are federal. So if you're not on that and you are interested, we have a general sign up, but if advocacy is what you're interested in, go ahead and put that in the notes. And Laura, I'm curious, I know public comment ended for the transit ban, the asylum ban. Is that still, it seems that's still being shaped and on the table. Is this still a good time to write to our representatives about Title 42 ending? And
Yeah,
what's
I mean,
happening
I
with
think
asylum?
that it certainly can be. I think it's tricky because they probably have already made up their minds at this point, but I think letting them know what people actually want is so critical. I'll just tell you, when I was talking about Title 42, both with Senator Bennett and with Senator Hickenlooper, they were saying, well, we need to have it in place until something else is in place. And until we have something else in place, we need to keep Title 42. And I was like, quite frankly, pretty shocked. The Biden administration took office ages ago, and they should have been thinking about what to put in place this whole time. And I think they have been, but they don't want to pivot in a direction that's different than where they are right now. And I feel pretty disenchanted when it comes to the policies that they have in place because they're really Republican policies, and that's not who I voted for. And I hope that other people who voted for a different administration and a different path forward are as outraged as I am and continue to tell the people that they've elected that this is not okay with us. And we won't continue to vote for them if this is what they are doing. Because I don't think that the policies that they're putting in place are pandering to their own constituents and the people who actually voted for them. It's almost they're just being responsive to people across the aisle who are commenting about their failures, but I personally don't feel like that's how we should lead.
Yeah, thank you for that. Okay, other questions here?
Hi, thank you so much for your presentation. I'm interested in that DACA case that was remanded to the Texas judge. So is the Texas judge just going to rewrite it and send it back to the Supreme Court? Is that what's going to happen there?
So it depends on what the decision says, and until we know what the decision says, we don't really know what the hook would be to continue to litigate the case. So it has been remanded for him to rewrite the decision, and basically the legal framework is very boring. It's about the Administrative Procedure Act and whether or not DACA adhered to this act that says that we need to have a certain process for passing new policies. And so it's remanded for him to look at that issue. So I don't know how it's going to go. It might be that that's the last step, or it might be that the way that he writes it again is also legally flawed, and so it's easily attacked. But regardless of how it happens, we're still in this legal limbo, and so I think really the ultimate remedy is for Congress to take some type of action such that then a judge wouldn't be able to, one single judge wouldn't be able to unilaterally set that type of policy.
Thank you.
Thank you, Laura. I've learned a lot. I have a highly specific question from the volunteering at the Volunteer Income Tax Assistance Group. I had someone come in who has asylum here. Unfortunately, I didn't know there were two types, affirmative and defensive, so I don't know
Well,
which
once
she
they win
has.
asylum, there's just one type.
Okay.
I was talking about how they're processed, so yes.
Okay, so that is a good answer. She just got married a couple of months ago.
Great.
And she asked her tax preparer, should I do something? She's been waiting 6 years to try to get a green card or be heard. Does she have to do something now that she's married to a U.S. citizen?
So she doesn't have to do something. Once people have asylum status, they can technically hold it for a while, but my recommendation is always to adjust your status and get your green card if you can, because it's a pathway to citizenship, and once you're a U.S. citizen, the government cannot deport you. Unless there's like some various exceptions that the Trump administration was trying to exercise, I'm sure you all remember. But it's the safest thing, because when I was talking about clients who've worked and lived in Colorado since like 1973, they often have had their green card for that entire time. And then, you know, you can't look into a crystal ball, you can't figure out if you're gonna get prosecuted for some type of crime that would jeopardize your ability to stay with your family for the rest of your life. And so, you know, if anyone has the opportunity to become a U.S. citizen as an immigration attorney, it's just like the safest bet. And that's always my recommendation.
So she could apply for a green card now, or does she have to wait
Well,
for 5 years?
if she's had asylum for 6 years,
Yes.
then she would be eligible to apply for her green card separate and apart from getting married to a U.S. citizen, because it provides a pathway to get your green card, and you don't have to, you know, have any type of relative here in order to be able to qualify.
Oh, very good, thank you.
Yeah.
What's the quickest anybody can become a citizen?
I would say the fastest way would probably be through marriage. It's complicated is the short answer. But the fastest way is if you marry a U.S. citizen, you can theoretically adjust your status within 3 years.
Who had talked about their daughter married a Brit, and he became a U.S. citizen, but she also led me to believe they gave somebody some significant money.
Yes.
Is that's
You know
a
what is a very
reality?
interesting phenomenon that I have noticed is U.S. citizens who marry people from England get outraged about the immigration system because they're like, this is baloney, that this is so hard, so costly, so, you know, time consuming. And typically what we see is that the process for them is much easier than it is from people from other countries.
Okay, that's,
I'd like to find out what the next fastest process is. I mean, what if you have a sponsor? What does it require to sponsor someone?
So there is no way to become a U.S. citizen just through a sponsor. No. You can sponsor a family member, and that's like a family-based pathway. And that's when we're talking about a spouse. That's the fastest of the family-based pathways. But there's no way for me to, like, say, sponsor somebody who I met when I was traveling in another country who I'm not related to. There's no mechanism for me to bring them here to become a U.S. citizen. What I was talking about is parole for certain countries when I was talking about Haiti, Nicaragua, Cuba, and Venezuela, how they have sponsors, or the Ukrainians, they can come with a sponsor, right? But that's for parole. And that's what I was saying is only like a 2-year period of time typically where people can stay and just kind of hang out as things hopefully get better in their home country. But that is not a pathway to a green card or to becoming a U.S. citizen. Is there a pathway? Yeah, so through family-based adjustment, so we're talking about spouses, but you have to have a lawful admission to be able to do that. So if you came into the country and you weren't admitted by a US government agent and you're living in the country and you marry a US citizen, you don't actually have a pathway automatically to adjust your status and get a green card. You have to have that lawful admission to be able to do that. So you can come as a spouse, you could bring other relatives, immediate relatives, so kiddos, your mom, things like, people like that, but you can't just like willy-nilly petition for anybody to be able to come into the United States and be on a pathway to citizenship.
A question as an economist. What's the privilege of all those contractors in the mountains, in the oil industry, especially fracking, and all the oil fields from Texas all the way to the Dakotas and New York, the ones who, the collectors of garbage? What is the privilege of those contractors that they hire enormous amount of illegal labor, and I have never seen Tom Tancredo protesting that. I have never seen any of our anti-immigrant representatives and governors, etc., talking to, let's say, bail associates. What is their privilege? What kind of lawyers do they have? Or it's called greasing the money, I mean, greasing the hands of somebody. I know the mafia, they kill them, but that's a different story.
Well,
what kind of lawyers?
I think the short answer is the people who do that are in positions of power such that they have more influence over how the laws are written, right? Because there isn't like a strong mechanism to prosecute employers for employing people who are here without lawful work permits. It does exist, but it doesn't happen very often, and you would have to build a really strong case and expend a huge amount of resources to hold people to account in that situation. What's much more common is the individual person who is working unlawfully being prosecuted for, criminal offenses related to that, or having issues with becoming a citizen because of the mechanisms that they use to be able to work here in the United States. And I think particular to Colorado, right, we're seeing a huge labor shortage, especially in the mountains, where some of the ski resorts were not able to open up all of the ski slopes this year. I heard people complaining about that, but it was because not because there wasn't enough snow, it's because there weren't enough people working, right? And so we also don't have enough housing in the mountains and all these types of problems that if we were able to get people work permits such that they could work lawfully more quickly, then it could actually help a lot of these problems that we're facing. But the truth is, even if we talked about all the barriers to even being able to knock on the door to apply for asylum, but even once you apply for asylum, it takes 6 months for you to be eligible to apply for a work permit. So what are you supposed to do in that limbo period of time? You need housing, you need to make sure your kids have access to school and food and all these things, right? So I agree with you. It's a topsy-turvy system, and it's really built to benefit some folks and as a detriment to others, right?
We've got a question back. I want to honor and recognize all of our amazing community navigators that are here with us today, many of whom work on the immigration hotline here in town, who are community leaders in all our mobile home parks. So thank you so much for the work that you do. And we have a question from this row of navigators about the U visa process. I know it's not something we talked about today, but for those of you that don't work in this space, this is for victims of domestic violence or victims of a crime. And is there a time period? Like, let's say your police report is from way back in the day. Is there a time period within which you have to apply for that status?
So, no, a U visa does not have a statute of limitations. I think the tricky part from the attorney's perspective is certain police departments destroy records after a certain amount of time. particularly in California, because there's so many people, they destroy records a lot more quickly than we do here in Colorado, for example. So it's a matter of being able to corroborate, because in order to qualify for a U visa, not only do you have to have experienced violence, you have to cooperate with law enforcement in the reporting of that crime. And so if you don't have that type of evidence to substantiate the fact that you did report whatever happened to you, then it's really almost impossible to actually access the U visa. But actually, I'm so glad that we had that question, because the Rocky Mountain Immigrant Advocacy Network, along with some of our other partners, and I'm sure Isaac was probably involved with this pretty heavily, helped pass a law in Colorado that says law enforcement offices have to sign U certification. So that's the thing that says that, yes, this person cooperated with law enforcement. For a long time, offices were just sitting on those requests and not signing them, such that the person could not apply for the visa. And it was a huge problem, and we know that it's still a problem even though this law has passed. Enforcing the law has been very, very tricky, especially in more conservative counties in Colorado. So I'm going to ask you all, if you hear that happening and you know that people are complaining about law enforcement not signing their U certification, even though they do have records of working with police or with a prosecutor to try and prosecute a crime, then that's certainly information that we would love to have, so that we can work on the back end to try and make sure that they're getting the education that they need to know that they have to adhere to that law.
Hi, I'm kind of dreaming even to ask this question, which is appropriate because it's a question about dreamers. Is there ever a situation, or can you imagine, where dreamers who right now, they're doing fine day to day, supposedly, except for all this stress, but they're stuck. They're fucking stuck, excuse me. Yes, I'm in a church and they're listening, good. Where they might actually think about, is there any way where they might do better than being a dreamer by trying to ask for asylum somehow?
If they're legally eligible for asylum, they can start, I would just say, as an attorney who has worked with a lot of dreamers, we always scrub every possible crevice of where they could apply for something that would put them on a pathway to citizenship. That's what I was talking about, of even when I had clients who were in high school, I would say, okay, do you have a sick relative where we could get you parole so you could go visit them in your home country and come back and get that lawful admission into the United States, such that when you're 35, if you meet a US citizen, you might be able to, remember what I was saying, you have to have that lawful admission to be able to adjust your status if you meet a US citizen. I would plan decades in advance of when they might actually meet a US citizen, such that they could qualify for a pathway to citizenship. So that's one avenue that we would explore. Certainly some of my DACA clients, we did end up applying for asylum, especially clients who were LGBTQ, who couldn't go back to their home country, and that was maybe not something that they had known when they were a little tiny kiddo when they first came to the United States, right? So, we're always looking for other ways, but the sad fact is, it is really hard to become a US citizen. The law is not living and breathing along with the population that we have here. And like I was saying, 1996 is the last time we had comprehensive immigration reform. What were you all doing in 1996? How have your lives shifted? Who is in your life who's different than was in your life back then, right? We need to really think through, how has our society and our community changed? And what laws do we need to reflect that in a way that benefits us all, that benefits our economy, that benefits our businesses, that benefits our loved ones, our community members, the parents of our that we talk to when are watching kids play soccer. It's just like, this is an issue that's around us each and every day, and I think we take it for granted that we just live our lives and don't have to think about it if we're US citizens ourselves or if we have some type of lawful status. But you're absolutely right when it comes to DACA recipients. They do feel stressed, and it's also fascinating to see the research that's been done of how much less stressed they felt once they had DACA. And it's not even a permanent status, and it can be taken away very easily, unfortunately, and I've seen that happen, right? The toll that it takes on people's mental health to be in this limbo status is horrific, and it strips them of all kinds of economic opportunities, right? Because I was saying you can't qualify for federal student loans if you don't have lawful status here in the United States generally, right? So the opportunity, I could not have paid for college without taking out student loans. So just thinking through, there are so many different ramifications within our society of what your lawful status is that a lot of us we take for granted and we don't think through, but it is something that people have to think about each and every day. I was talking to a friend who said that her father was pulled over for having a taillight out when he was driving after dark and was arrested by ICE when she was in high school, and it was horrifically traumatizing. And her family made a rule that none of them would leave the house after 7 p.m. after that happened. Can you imagine shifting your life that significantly just based on these fears? And that is what we're talking about. And so that's why I'm so grateful that all of you are spending your time on a Sunday when you could be out gallivanting, having a beautiful day, learning about this so that you can be a steward of this issue and pass it on to people in your lives so that others can truly better understand what it is that we're talking about and why it is so important to have these types of changes.
Thank you. I was going to say that's a great one to end on, but then I saw 5 more. Let's take 2 more questions. I can feel people fidgeting in their seats a little bit. So let's take 2 more questions, and then we are going to have some snacks and drinks and coffee, and we can keep talking and we can hold Laura hostage for 1 more half hour.
I wanted to ask more about your organization and how we can support you, because it sounds like there's a need for more and more lawyers who can help, and that would help a lot, considering the backlog, considering how many people can't get representation. So are you funded totally by donations, or how does that work?
So we have mixed funding streams. We are a nonprofit, but we do have some government funding, and I'm so glad you asked this question because as I mentioned at the outset of this conversation, Fort Collins is an inspiration, right? Because you all have a legal defense fund, and there's not a ton of money in it. So if there were more money, more people would get attorneys. And Remain, the organization where I work, Remain, we do take some of those cases, but it's truly not about us. It's about making sure people have access to counsel, and that's our main goal, advocacy goal right now. And the same is true for the state of Colorado. For perspective, the city of Denver has $750,000 in its legal defense fund. The state of Colorado has $350,000. So again, talking to your legislators at the state House and Senate is critical so that they know this is a priority, that they know that they need to try and get more funding put into our statewide bill such that we have the resources to provide more people access to counsel. And the more people that you give attorneys to, the higher their success rates are, right? And then it pays forward because they get to stay here with their families, they get to stay at their jobs, they get to stay in their homes, and it's better for our communities.
Last question. Same. Okay, great. Okay, we'll end up here in front.
Okay. So this might be a conversation we can have afterwards, but we support a children's home in Manzanillo in Colima. And we've got 4 siblings in the orphanage who are victims of a trafficking situation. One, the older, it might be too late. But I'm looking for options. We're trying to get them out. They're currently in protective custody, which is only temporary. Mm-hmm. It's a cartel situation, so it's kind of urgent that we try to do something. And I'd like to see if you have any resources, ideas, contacts, anything like that.
Yeah, I think it would be great for us to touch base afterward.
Right, thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, I know we have more questions, but we are going to break in just a minute here. There's all kinds of sweet snacks and fruits and things in the fellowship hall. I want to also thank Itzel and Diana for their interpretation. This is part of, let's give a round of applause. This is a lot of really dense information to be interpreting simultaneously while Laura is speaking. And I also just want to honor this cohort of young adults in our community who are superheroes, bilingual, bicultural superheroes, should be seen as such. They are the people that are going to make us a truly multicultural community, and their work is, we appreciate it so much. So thank you both for always showing up for us. We're involved in a lot of work. A lot of it's in partnership with other amazing organizations. This sometimes feels like out of touch, and you feel like you can make, one call to a representative. If you're working on hotline, you might be able to help a family one at a time. There's so many ways to plug in. We have a little bit of literature in the back. I'll be in the back room. Lorena is going to be in the back room, my colleague Lorena Mendoza. We are the ones that are putting out those grants for families that are getting legal representation. And we have $85,000 that we are using this year. We've already used $35,000 in the first 3 months of the year. I just checked. Those are for Fort Collins residents, people that are living in Fort Collins. In order to help people in Loveland, Estes Park, and less resourced communities in terms of nonprofits, we really have to draw on private donations. And it's really heartbreaking when we can say yes to a family that's on this border of our municipality, and we have to say no to a family in Loveland. I know Carolina works and Tomas work with those families in Loveland. So we welcome donations to help kind of beef up that fund. Like you're saying, the money goes fast. But if you have cases and you're working with people that have questions, sometimes it's just we can pay for a consult, for a 60 to 90-minute consultation to explore all these options, right? So come to us. If their cases remain, our partner Remain can take, we'll refer them there. If our partners Alianza Norco can take it, we'll refer them there. And if no one can take it, like it's a defensive asylum, we'll keep it in-house, and then we have a network of about 5 attorneys that are amazing women, all low bono attorneys that only represent low-income clients, and we can help them with a scholarship. So we'd love to talk to you more. We have various board members here. Our board chair, San Valdez Birch, is here in the back. So come talk to us about the work that we're doing, and we'll keep working on the advocacy piece. So thank you so much, Laura. We just absolutely love having you here. We need to have you every year.
Thank you all so much. I really appreciate it. Thank you, RP. This is great.
We got a lot of donuts, coffee, and juice, so please go help me eat them. Otherwise, I have to take them home.
Oh, yeah, that's dangerous.
Oh, my gosh. I like it.